It was a typical morning at the airport, the kind where the hustle and bustle of people moving in all directions felt almost comforting. John Williams, a businessman who had spent the past few days in back-to-back meetings, sat at his gate with a sigh of relief. His flight from New York to Los Angeles was on time, and for once, he was looking forward to a few quiet hours in first class. His briefcase rested on the seat beside him. His phone buzzed with an email notification, but for the moment, he allowed himself to disconnect from the world. After all, this was supposed to be a simple, uneventful flight. Little did he know, everything was about to change. As he boarded, the staff greeted him warmly, but there was an unusual tension in the air. The first-class cabin was mostly full, but a woman seated a few rows ahead of John was already causing a stir. Her voice was sharp, demanding, and the moment she stood up to approach the flight attendant, John could tell something was off. He didn't know it yet, but this was the woman who would soon turn his life upside down. The woman, dressed in a designer outfit, had stormed up to the front of the plane. She was fuming, her face flushed with anger, and the flight attendants were trying to calm her down, but it was clear that wasn't going to happen. John overheard snippets of her argument, something about her seat being uncomfortable and not meeting her expectations for the high price she had paid. Her voice grew louder and more abrasive, calling out the flight attendants by name, demanding that someone do something about her disastrous experience. It wasn't long before she made her way to the front, where she started raising her voice at the head flight attendant, accusing them of poor service. John didn't want to get involved. He glanced out the window, hoping the flight would take off soon and the drama would fade into the background. He didn't like confrontation, especially on a plane where things could escalate so quickly. But then it happened. The woman turned her attention to him. It was as if, in that moment, John became the target of her frustration. She was standing right next to his seat now, blocking the aisle and glaring at him with disdain. "Excuse me, sir. Could you please move your armrest up? I can barely fit into my seat because of you," she snapped, her tone dripping with entitlement. John froze. He had never seen this woman before, and yet she was now accusing him of occupying too much space. He glanced at his armrest, then at her, and instinctively began to slide his arm away. He tried to smile, to diffuse the situation, but the woman wasn't interested in politeness. She continued to berate him for making her feel uncomfortable in a space that was clearly designed for relaxation. It wasn't long before the flight attendants came over, trying to manage the situation, but it was clear the woman wasn't backing down. The flight crew asked her to return to her seat, but she refused, demanding a change, or she would take this up with the airline when we land. As the confrontation intensified, John could feel the weight of the situation creeping in. His hope that it would end quietly was slipping away. The tension in the cabin became palpable. John noticed the other passengers, who were mostly silent at first, starting to exchange worried glances. Some were whispering, pulling out their phones to record the scene. The woman's voice rose even higher, and her demands grew more ridiculous by the minute. She was now claiming that the entire first-class section was too cramped, and she refused to sit until something was done about it. Her tantrum escalated into a full-blown scene, one that no one could ignore. At this point, John could feel the eyes of everyone in the cabin on him. He was caught in the middle of something that was quickly turning into a spectacle. The flight attendants, visibly uncomfortable, were doing their best to keep the situation under control. They asked her once more to return to her seat, and when she refused, the tension in the air seemed to crackle. But what happened next was beyond anything John could have anticipated. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but it wasn't the typical cheerful tone one might expect. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered an issue. We are requesting cooperation from everyone on board as we address a situation that is affecting the safety of the flight. Please remain in your seats." There was a brief pause before he added, "We may be delayed as we resolve this matter." John's heart sank. He looked out the window, trying to escape the situation, But the feeling of unease hung heavy in the cabin. It wasn't just the noise anymore. It was the realization that things were quickly spiraling out of control. And then, in the chaos that followed, it happened. The woman, who had once been a mere nuisance, suddenly became the catalyst for something far larger than any of them could have imagined. John couldn't shake the sense of disbelief that clung to him as the flight continued. He had expected this trip to be a reprieve, a break from the long, stressful work week. Instead, he found himself caught in the middle of a high-stakes drama that was escalating with each passing minute. The woman, who had started out as a mere annoyance, was now the center of a brewing storm, and it was clear that things were about to get even more out of hand. As the plane finally took off, the tension in the cabin didn't ease. John had never been one for conflict, and the idea of a confrontation made his stomach churn. He tried to focus on his laptop, pretending to work as if he could somehow shut out the chaos around him. But it was impossible. Every few minutes, the woman's raised voice cut through the calm hum of the aircraft. She was still arguing with the flight attendants, her demands growing increasingly outrageous. John overheard snippets of her tirade. "This is unacceptable. I paid for first class, and this is how I'm treated." He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some of them glancing his way, wondering if he would step in. But John was paralyzed, caught in the crossfire of a situation he never could have predicted. What could he say? How could he get involved without making things worse? The flight attendants, who were doing their best to maintain order, seemed to be losing control of the situation. They exchanged quick, furtive glances as the woman grew louder, her tantrum drawing more attention from the other passengers. The woman's rant grew more personal. She started to question the competence of the crew, calling them incompetent and useless. She demanded to speak to the captain. When they refused, she began loudly criticizing the airline itself, using every opportunity to turn her frustration into an all-out assault on everyone within earshot. The passengers, who had once tried to ignore the disruption, were now visibly uncomfortable, some shifting in their seats, others glancing nervously at the flight attendants. And then, just as John thought the situation couldn't get any worse, it did. The flight attendant, who had been trying to manage the confrontation, snapped. She had been patient, trying to reason with the woman, but it was clear that nothing was going to change. With a final, exasperated breath, the flight attendant turned to the woman and said, "You need to return to your seat, or we'll be forced to take further action." The woman's face twisted in outrage as she shot back, "You'll have to drag me off this plane if you want me to sit down." John was already starting to feel the weight of the situation. He was a spectator, a bystander caught in a moment that seemed to have spiraled out of control, but something inside him told him he had to do something. He wasn't sure what, but he couldn't just sit there, watching as the chaos unfolded. The other passengers were starting to murmur nervously, but no one seemed willing to intervene. As if on cue, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom again. This time, it was urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a serious issue that must be addressed. We need your full cooperation. Please remain in your seats and allow the crew to handle the situation." The authority in the captain's voice was unmistakable, but it was also clear that the flight crew was now operating under a great deal of pressure. John felt his heart race. The woman, now standing in the aisle, was refusing to comply, her voice rising in defiance. "This is outrageous. I paid for a premium experience, and I'm being treated like a criminal." She was now blocking the aisle completely, refusing to move back to her seat. Her words hung in the air, and John could feel the ripple of unease spreading through the cabin. It was no longer just an argument. It was a standoff, and no one knew how it would end. The flight attendants looked at each other, clearly at a loss. John's mind raced. He could feel the pressure building inside him, his instincts telling him that something had to give. But just when it seemed like the situation would either de-escalate or explode into something worse, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. A voice that wasn't part of the flight crew, but belonged to another passenger, a man seated behind the woman. His words were calm, measured, yet firm. "Ma'am, you need to sit down. If you don't, this is going to end badly for everyone." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the woman froze. For a brief moment, John thought the woman would back down. But instead, her face flushed with fury. She whirled around, pointing directly at the man who had spoken, and her voice, shrill and venomous, boomed across the cabin. "How dare you tell me what to do?" John's heart sank as he realized this moment could be the tipping point. The flight attendants were still trying to talk the woman down, but now it was clear that this wasn't just about customer service. This was about power, control, and something far darker than John had originally thought. And the moment the woman finally screamed at the flight attendants to get the authorities involved was the moment that set everything in motion. John knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to be a simple case of a passenger being escorted off the plane. He was witnessing something much bigger, something that would alter not just his trip, but potentially his entire understanding of the way people behave under pressure. The woman's meltdown wasn't just a nuisance. It was a public spectacle, one that would haunt everyone involved for a long time to come. As the plane continued to climb, the weight of the situation began to settle in. Whatever happened next, John knew it would change everything. And he had no idea how far this could go. The tension in the cabin was now suffocating, and it felt as if every passenger had drawn a collective breath, waiting for something to break. John's eyes flicked from the woman, still standing defiantly in the aisle, to the flight attendants, who were now visibly rattled. It was clear that the calm professionalism they'd shown earlier was no match for the growing chaos. The other passengers were no longer pretending to ignore the situation. The low hum of whispers had intensified into a chorus of concerned voices. The flight crew exchanged looks, and John could see the strain on their faces. They were trying to control the situation, but the woman was relentless, her sense of entitlement matching the ferocity of a storm. With every minute, the situation grew more absurd. The woman, her voice still shrill and demanding, continued to block the aisle, making it nearly impossible for the flight attendants to move past her. "I'll get the authorities involved," she shouted again, her eyes blazing with fury. Her words were venomous, but they were also a signal that she had crossed a line. This wasn't just a complaint anymore. It was a declaration of war. The situation had moved beyond a mere inconvenience into something much more complicated. Her tantrum had escalated to the point where the flight attendants could no longer handle it on their own. John couldn't understand why this woman was so fixated on getting her way. He had seen difficult passengers before, people complaining about the food, the service, the delay in boarding. But this was different. This wasn't just about discomfort. This was about power. The way the woman held the aisle hostage, her refusal to cooperate, was not just an expression of dissatisfaction. It was an assertion of control. It was as if the very act of throwing her weight around in that cramped, confined space gave her a sense of triumph, a fleeting but powerful victory in a world that hadn't always treated her the way she wanted. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had always prided himself on being the kind of person who could stay out of the drama, who could keep his head down and let others take the spotlight. But now, he was caught in the eye of a storm. He wasn't just a passive observer. He was part of the story, and no amount of wishing would change that. The woman's rant was beginning to wear thin even with the other passengers. He could see the looks of disdain, the uncomfortable shifting in seats as more and more people began to realize the severity of the situation. Some had started to take out their phones, recording everything with the hope of capturing this spectacle for later. But then, a strange thing happened. John noticed that the flight attendants had become more determined. The polite requests for the woman to sit down had turned into firm orders. Their body language was no longer uncertain. They were preparing for a confrontation, something that had become inevitable. It wasn't just about offering a service anymore. It was about maintaining order, protecting the safety of everyone on board. As much as John had tried to avoid getting involved, he could feel the rising sense of urgency that came with knowing this wasn't just a disagreement. It was a crisis. Without warning, one of the flight attendants, A woman in her late 30s who had been trying to remain calm throughout the ordeal stepped forward. "Ma'am, if you do not return to your seat immediately, we will have to take further action. Please cooperate, for your own safety and the safety of the other passengers." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a finality that told John the situation was about to take a dramatic turn. For a moment, the woman paused, her defiance faltering. It was as if she was considering whether to back down or escalate the situation further. Then, with a huff of indignation, she took a step back, but not to sit down. Instead, she moved toward the galley, muttering under her breath, "This is outrageous. I'm not going to be treated like this. I'll make sure every last person here knows how terrible this airline is." John's stomach sank. He had hoped that the situation might finally resolve itself, but it was clear that the woman wasn't done. She wasn't interested in compromise, and the longer the confrontation dragged on, the more uncertain John felt about how things might end. What happened next would change everything, not just for the woman, but for everyone involved. As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life again, and this time it wasn't the flight attendants or the captain speaking. It was the unmistakable voice of the head of cabin crew, a man who had been overseeing the situation from the back of the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are requesting cooperation from everyone on board. Due to the nature of the current situation, we will be asking for law enforcement to meet us upon arrival. Please stay seated and remain calm." John's heart skipped a beat. Law enforcement. He looked around at the other passengers, who were now whispering to each other in hushed tones. The realization hit him like a wave. This was no longer just about bad behavior. It had become something much more serious. The moment the word law enforcement was spoken, everything changed. People began to shift in their seats, their expressions tense, aware that things were escalating beyond what anyone had predicted. John felt a rush of adrenaline flood his system, his senses sharpened by the weight of what was happening. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the woman seemed to realize that her game had reached its end. She froze in the galley, her back turned to the rest of the cabin. But the shift in her posture was unmistakable. She wasn't just angry now. She was scared. Her shoulders slumped, the fury draining out of her as the reality of the situation began to settle in. John could see it clearly. She had reached the breaking point. But was it too late? The tension was thick in the air, and no one knew how far this would go. As the plane flew on, John couldn't help but wonder, would this be the moment when everything changed for the woman? Would she realize the consequences of her actions, or would this escalate further into something even more chaotic? What happened next was something that no one on that flight could have predicted, least of all John. The plane was now cruising at a steady altitude, the steady hum of the engines filling the cabin, but the atmosphere was anything but calm. John's mind raced as he tried to process what was unfolding in front of him. The flight attendants were still trying to manage the situation, their voices now quiet but firm as they navigated the woman through what had become a public showdown. Every few moments, the woman shot venomous looks at the staff, her eyes narrowed with anger and resentment. Her earlier defiance had softened into something else, something darker. The feeling of tension in the cabin was almost palpable, like a thin wire stretched to its breaking point, ready to snap at any moment. And then it happened. The moment that would forever change the course of this flight, and in many ways, the lives of everyone on board. The woman, whose name John still didn't know, suddenly turned to face the flight attendants, and with a scornful sneer, blurted out, "You can't just kick me off this plane. I'll sue you all for this. You're ruining my vacation." Her voice cracked with a mixture of fury and desperation. It was no longer just about her comfort. It was about humiliation, her dignity. At least, the version she had built for herself had been completely stripped away, and she couldn't bear it. John watched as one of the flight attendants, a calm but clearly weary woman, took a step forward. Her face was lined with professionalism, but the tension in her posture revealed the strain of having dealt with this woman for so long. "Ma'am, I'm afraid this situation has escalated beyond what we can handle in the air. We've already notified airport security, and they will be meeting us when we land. If you don't return to your seat, we will have no choice but to have you escorted off the plane." The words were deliberate, controlled, but there was an edge to them. The flight attendants had reached the point of no return, where diplomacy was no longer an option. It was no longer just a dispute over first-class space. This was about the safety of everyone on board. The woman's face twisted with indignation. Her jaw clenched, and she glared at the attendant. "You think I'm going to sit down and just let you control me? Not a chance." She took another step into the aisle, ignoring the flight attendant's instructions to sit down. Her body was tense, and her hands shook with the raw energy of her anger. John could feel the ripple of fear spread through the cabin as the reality of the situation sank in. It was clear the flight attendants had reached the limit of what they could do. One of them turned toward the back of the plane, gesturing to another crew member. "We need the captain. Now." The realization hit John like a thunderclap. This was no longer just a disagreement. This was a public spectacle that was quickly turning into something far more dangerous. The woman wasn't just an unruly passenger. She was now a threat to the entire flight. John couldn't help but wonder what the crew was planning, but he had a sinking feeling that things were about to get far worse. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The flight attendant stood poised, watching the woman as she continued to pace down the aisle, her movements erratic. Her body language screamed defiance. The other passengers sat in uncomfortable silence, most of them avoiding eye contact, some of them pretending to be absorbed in their phones or books. No one was truly able to escape the growing sense of impending chaos. Finally, the captain's voice came over the intercom. And this time, there was no calm reassurance. There was no friendly announcement about the flight's progress or the weather. Instead, the captain's voice was direct, commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that we are unable to resolve the situation with one of our passengers. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we approach an emergency landing. Airport authorities will be meeting us on the ground to assist with the removal of the passenger." The gravity of the situation hit John in an instant. Emergency landing. That was something reserved for life-or-death scenarios. It wasn't something to be taken lightly, and the cold dread that washed over him in that moment was enough to freeze him in place. This was no longer a simple flight. It was now a matter of public safety, and the woman had pushed it to this point. John glanced at the woman, who had turned away from the flight attendants and was staring out of the window, her back to the rest of the cabin. Her chest rose and fell with deep, angry breaths, and for a moment, John wondered what was going through her mind. Did she realize how far she had gone? Did she understand the consequences of her actions? The rest of the passengers were shifting uncomfortably in their seats now, some craning their necks to see what would happen next. It felt like the entire plane had held its breath, collectively bracing for the unknown. The flight attendants exchanged anxious looks. They were clearly at a loss for what to do next. No one had prepared them for a situation like this. Not in training, not in any manual. This wasn't just a passenger complaint or a case of poor customer service. This was a matter of control, of someone refusing to acknowledge the authority of those around them. And then, in an unexpected twist, the woman turned back to face the flight attendants. Her expression was no longer just one of anger. It was a mix of defiance and something else, something deeper. She wasn't afraid anymore. No, she was determined to make sure that no one would get the satisfaction of winning. She wanted the last word, and with a voice that cracked under the pressure, she spat out, "You'll regret this. You have no idea who I am." The flight attendants didn't flinch. They had heard it all before: threats, insults, promises of legal action. But none of that mattered anymore. The woman had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She was no longer a passenger. She had become a liability, a danger to the other passengers, and everyone knew it. As the plane began its descent, John could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew, without a doubt, that this flight was going to land in a way no one had expected. The woman's refusal to comply, her unyielding demand for control, had set off a chain of events that couldn't be stopped. What happened next was beyond anyone's control, and when the plane finally touched down, everything would change, not just for the woman, but for everyone who had witnessed the disaster unfold before them. The plane's descent felt surreal to John. As the aircraft began to tilt downward, cutting through the clouds, there was a strange quiet that settled over the cabin. It wasn't peaceful, far from it. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, when everyone knows something big is about to happen, but no one is entirely sure how it will unfold. The woman, still standing with a defiant posture in the aisle, seemed to have lost any sense of fear, her earlier panic now buried beneath a thick layer of stubborn pride. The flight attendants remained silent, their stoic faces betraying none of the fear or frustration they must have been feeling. They were preparing for the inevitable, and so, too, were the passengers, who sat in uneasy silence, dreading the moment when they would finally land. John, though a mere observer in all this chaos, felt a weight on his chest that had nothing to do with the descent. This was no longer a simple dispute between a disgruntled passenger and airline staff. The situation had escalated to something larger, something that would affect everyone on board. He had seen the woman's fury and her refusal to yield, and now it was clear that this was going to be far more than just a late arrival or an awkward flight. The authorities were waiting for them, and they had been informed of what was going on. No one knew exactly what that would look like once they landed, but John had a sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't going to end well. As the plane touched down with a soft jolt, a murmur rippled through the cabin. It was the sound of relief, but it was also the sound of dread. The knowledge that whatever happened next would be out of their hands. The wheels screeched against the tarmac, signaling the end of the flight, but there was no cheer from the passengers, no lighthearted chatter. The woman remained rigid in her seat, her arms crossed, her jaw clenched. Her eyes were dark with anger, but there was also something else there now. Was it fear, regret, or was it just the dawning realization that her actions had led her to this point? No one could say for sure. The moment the plane came to a full stop, the cabin door opened. It wasn't the flight attendants who were first through the door, but two airport security officers, their uniforms sharp and purposeful. They moved with a quiet urgency, their eyes scanning the cabin before they approached the woman. She was still seated, refusing to acknowledge them at first, her body stiff with indignation. The security officers didn't say a word. One of them reached down to gently, but firmly, take her arm. That was the moment the woman finally broke. Her anger melted away in an instant, replaced by something almost childlike, a look of complete and utter disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom what was happening. No, this isn't right, she sputtered, her voice breaking. I paid for this. I'm a paying customer. You can't do this to me. Her words were desperate, pleading, but they fell on deaf ears. The officers exchanged a look but remained silent, their grip tightening just enough to let her know that there was no room for negotiation. They were doing their job, and no amount of shouting, pleading, or threats would change that. John watched as the scene unfolded before him, unable to look away. The other passengers were similarly transfixed, but now a sense of quiet satisfaction began to permeate the cabin. It wasn't that anyone was particularly thrilled to see this woman's downfall. It was more that they had witnessed something monumental. The entitlement, the sense of invulnerability she had carried with her, had been shattered. And the weight of that realization seemed to settle on everyone in the cabin, especially John. He had never been one for confrontation, but now he found himself in the middle of something that transcended any personal discomfort. He had seen the woman at her worst, and now he was seeing her at her most vulnerable. As the security officers began to escort the woman off the plane, the atmosphere shifted once again. The passengers, who had been so silent during the entire ordeal, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some were still shocked by the gravity of the situation, while others whispered words of relief. It was almost as if a collective sigh of relief had washed over them. No one had wanted things to escalate this far, but in some way, it was necessary. The situation had reached a point where someone needed to step in and take control. The authorities had done just that. But for John, the aftermath was more complicated. He sat in his seat, his mind still racing. What had just happened? How had something as trivial as a complaint about a seat turned into a full-blown public spectacle? He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as he processed the events. It wasn't just about the woman anymore. It was about what had happened to everyone around her. The flight attendants had been forced into a position where they had to make tough decisions. The passengers had witnessed something that none of them would forget. And for John, the entire experience had left him questioning how far people were willing to go to protect their own sense of entitlement, even at the cost of others. The plane was soon empty, and as John made his way toward the exit, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed a defining moment. The woman, still flanked by security, was led off the plane, her defiance now replaced by a quiet resignation. The world outside the plane's windows looked the same, but it felt different somehow. The chaos of the flight had spilled over into the real world, and now the consequences were rippling through the air. John walked out into the terminal, the weight of the day still hanging on him. He couldn't help but wonder what the woman would face next. What would happen to her after all of this? Would she learn anything from the experience, or would she simply blame others for what had happened? And what about the passengers who had witnessed it? Would they forget, or would they carry this story with them, telling their friends and families about the day a woman lost control and brought the entire flight to a standstill? As he made his way to the baggage claim, John felt an unexpected sense of reflection. He had witnessed something that most people only read about or hear on the news. But now, he was part of it. He would carry this story with him, just as the other passengers would. And when he returned to his family, when he finally sat down to tell them about his flight, he knew that the question that lingered in his mind would linger in theirs too. How far is too far? What would it take for any of us to cross the line? And when we do, what are the consequences? For John, this was no longer just an isolated incident. It was a question about the nature of people, the lengths they would go to for control, and the price they were willing to pay for it. As the days passed, John couldn't shake the feeling that the incident on the plane had changed something fundamental within him. It wasn't just about the drama of the moment or the spectacle of the woman's outburst. What stuck with him was the ripple effect of her actions, how one person's decision to throw their weight around in a public space had managed to unsettle an entire community, both inside and outside the plane. He thought about the passengers who had witnessed the chaos. He wondered what they would remember from the ordeal. Would they focus on the woman's tantrum? Would they talk about the flight attendants who had stepped in to control the situation? Or would they walk away with a broader, more unsettling question? What kind of person could do something like that? The morning after the flight, the story was everywhere. It had gone viral, almost instantly, picked up by news outlets, and shared on social media in a frenzy. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some sided with the woman, calling her a victim of poor service and a broken system. Others condemned her, calling her out for her entitlement and lack of respect for authority. John found himself scrolling through the endless comments, his fingers hovering over his phone, unsure whether to engage. But no matter how many opinions he read, one thing became abundantly clear. There was no clear-cut answer. The situation had sparked a heated debate that was spreading across the internet, spilling over into every social conversation. He couldn't help but think about what had led to the woman's behavior, what had caused her to act out in such a way. John didn't know her backstory, but he began to wonder if there were other, deeper issues at play. Was this an isolated incident, or was it just the culmination of years of frustration and feeling unheard? She had been so adamant about her rights, so unwilling to back down, and that level of intensity seemed to come from somewhere deeper. In a way, it almost felt like the woman's actions were a reflection of something larger happening in society. a breakdown in civility, a loss of mutual respect, and a growing sense of individual entitlement that seemed to be popping up everywhere. For John, the question became, how far can we push before we break? It was a question that didn't just apply to the woman on the plane, but to everyone. How far could you push someone before they hit their limit? And when they did, how would they react? The thing that unsettled him most was that, at one point, he had felt sympathetic toward her. When she first started complaining, when she was simply upset about the space in her seat, he could understand her frustration. It wasn't ideal. But somewhere along the way, something changed. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about power, control, and the refusal to accept any solution that didn't align with her version of reality. She had gone from an upset passenger to an unwilling participant in a very public spectacle, and in doing so, she dragged everyone around her into it. John had learned something from the experience, something that felt uncomfortable but necessary. The world wasn't as simple as he had once thought. He had always believed in keeping the peace, avoiding conflict, letting things slide when they seemed petty or trivial. But now, he saw how dangerous that approach could be in the wrong circumstances. He had witnessed, firsthand, what could happen when a situation spiraled out of control, and no one intervened until it was too late. People's personal frustrations, their sense of injustice, could quickly explode into something far more dangerous. Back home, John tried to resume his life, but the echoes of the incident followed him. When he sat down with his family over dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to the incident. His wife, Maria, had watched the news coverage, and like many others, she was shocked at how far it had gone. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "How could she think that was the right thing to do? It just feels so out of touch with reality." John thought about it for a moment. He could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air, but he wasn't sure he had an answer. He didn't want to defend the woman's actions, but part of him understood that her behavior wasn't born in a vacuum. "I think maybe she just felt like she didn't have any other option," he said slowly. "Maybe she thought that by making a scene, by forcing people to listen, she could get what she wanted. But it wasn't just about the seat. It was about something bigger, something that's been building up for a long time." Maria looked at him, her brow furrowed. "But that's not how you handle things." She could have just asked for a different seat, or calmed down. "There's no reason to make everyone uncomfortable." John sighed. "I know. But sometimes people lose sight of the consequences. They get so caught up in their own frustration that they don't think about how it affects others. And when that happens, it's easy to cross a line." As he spoke, John couldn't help but wonder if this was a turning point for the woman, or if she would continue down the same path. Would she learn from the incident, or would she see herself as a martyr, a victim of an unjust system? There was something haunting in the way her actions had rippled through the lives of everyone on the flight. She wasn't just a woman having a bad day. She had become a symbol of something larger, a reflection of a society that was increasingly unwilling to compromise, unwilling to listen. And that scared John. Because if we didn't learn to manage our anger, our frustration, our need to control everything around us, the world would only get louder, more chaotic, and harder to navigate. As time went on, John began to see the ripple effects of the incident, how it had changed the community around him. Some passengers had found their own voices in the aftermath, posting their opinions online, discussing how they felt about what had happened. Others felt a sense of relief, grateful that the situation hadn't escalated further. But what surprised John most was the sense of collective reflection that seemed to hang in the air. People were asking themselves how they would react in the same situation. What would they do if they were the ones who felt wronged? How far would they go to make sure their voices were heard? John didn't have all the answers, but he had learned one thing. There were consequences to every action, and the line between right and wrong was often blurred in the heat of the moment. The incident had forced everyone to confront that uncomfortable truth, and the real question, John realized, was not what had happened on that plane, but what would happen next. How would people continue to interact with each other in the real world? Would they choose to listen, to compromise, or would they continue to let their egos rule their decisions? It was a question without an easy answer, but one that was now at the forefront of John's mind, and perhaps of society's as well. And in the end, maybe that was the most important lesson of all.